Again, I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Mom would definitely have blushed at the turnout, but after a couple surly beers, she would have said, "Hey, ain't this great?" I want to try something here real quick. Conduct a little test. I know there's at least one person in the room who will understand this. If I were to say hum jumbo, would I get a response from anybody? How about I say hum jumbo and the rest of you all say hatu jumbo? So let's try it again. Hum jumbo. Hatu jumbo. You just said hello in Swahili. One of 6 or 7 languages that Mom spoke. She was an English major. She minored in German. She took Russian and spoke Latin, even though no one speaks Latin anymore, let alone write it. And for her duties in the Peace Corps, she studied Amharic and Tigrinya and learned some Swahili on the side. I'd like to start with a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. It's the first line, actually, to The Great Gatsby. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. That line is definitely true for Chris and I. Chris and me. Sorry, Mom. And a lot of that is due to her. So, I would also like to extend thank yous to Senator Ann Rest, Representative Deborah Hillstrom. I would also like to extend a very special thank you to the Reverend Paul Alec of St. George's Episcopal Church in St. Louis Park. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the Joint Honor and Color Guard, the brave men and women of Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center Police and Fire Departments, as well as representatives from the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department. Mother was extremely proud to work with each of those organizations, although she probably did give just a little bit of favoritism to the Brooklyn Park Police Department. After all, they let her shoot an MP5 submachine gun from time to time. She attended the Citizens Police Academy, and I'll never forget the day she came home and said, "Wow," you know, that was her favorite expression. And I'll tell you why a little later, Deb. Do you think we can we buy these legally? I'm like, no, Mom. Just because you saw it in one of your ninja movies that you love to watch over and over again, no, we can't buy an MP5. A little bit of irony, I didn't want to embarrass the fire chief, but I wanted to say I was a little shocked that she was getting this award, because I know she was a big advocate for the change in the firecracker laws, and I think it helped carry some water on that as well. But that was Mom, a little bit of common sense. You know, we're not going to have mass explosions everywhere, and I don't think there have been too many accidents, but that was her, trying to find common sense solutions to problems that, you know, judging by the press and the reaction from people, seem really complicated and difficult to figure out. The story of her getting kicked off the tax committee, Paula, you didn't know this, Deb, you didn't know this. She didn't want that story told. She was embarrassed. And I was like, "Are you kidding me? That's, you know, that's a badge of honor." That's what, and this was 20 plus years ago. And we look at, you know, political climate today, and, you know, sometimes we're like, gosh, you know, I wish, you know, one of them would grow a set, or da 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 da. And I'm like, Mom, we gotta talk about it, because then it leads to the almost more interesting story, apocryphal perhaps, but Governor Rudy Perpich came up to her about a year or so later and said, "Well, aren't you going to thank me for, you know, appointing Speaker Norton to a judgeship so that Vanessa could get you back on the tax committee?" I didn't really mean to begin by talking about Mom and her love of guns and shooting. Ann and Deborah spoke to you about Mother, the senator, the legislator, and I want to speak to you about Mother, the mom. And I I won't keep you in suspense any longer. The reason wow was her favorite exclamation was because she was a big fan of coming up with palindromes. Sentences or words that read the same, front and back. And if you turn wow upside down, it's mom. Please pardon the pun, but she was a pistol. She loved literature and theater. Near the end, she was still rattling off her favorite poem, Unter der Linden, in spot-on German. She referenced Waiting for Godot and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It was Becky who suggested we start to keep a guest book list so we could keep track of the people who come and go into the house. And she raised her head and said, "Speaking of Michelangelo," which is the line from Prufrock. Amazing, absolutely amazing. She exposed Christopher and I to every kind of literature, every kind of theater, the Walker Art Center. When I was just 9 and Chris was 6, she decided both of us were ready for Hamlet at the Guthrie. A very important fun part of our weeks, especially in the summer, were library visits. She would take us to the library weekly, and we could take out any book we wanted. She expected us to read it and tell her about the book. And I can't remember a time when either at home or traveling around the country, if Chris or I wanted a book, the book got purchased. Reading was very, very important to her. Funny story, Chris and a good neighborhood friend, Steve Oliver, skipped school once when they were in the 5th grade. And I don't think Chris had ever done much of anything but good. I mean, she always referred to Kip as my good citizen. And she would come home and tell me, "Hey, another week I didn't see your photo in the post office. That's probably good." But lo and behold, Chris and Steve decided to skip school, and they weren't going to get in any real trouble. In fact, they were just down the road at Hamilton Park, swinging on a swing set. Well, Mom, we always suspected, secretly worked for the KGB. She could hear things that, were practically inaudible, and she had a knack of showing up just as you were about to, or just seconds after you had done something you weren't supposed to have done. And sure enough, she came home and noticed Kippy's lunch is still on the kitchen counter. Well, being the good mother that I am, I'll run it up to him at school. So she goes to the office, and the principal's office says, "You better take the lunch down there yourself. Mrs. Davidson will want to talk to you," the teacher. So she goes down and opens the door, and "Mrs. Davidson, I've brought Christopher's lunch." Mrs. Davidson, I almost probably dropped dead of a heart attack, because even in the early 80s, missing child was probably a pretty serious thing. And so she relayed to Mom, "Christopher isn't in school today." And yeah. Speaking of sack lunches, Mother got the biggest kick out of the most mundane and arduous things. I don't think my brother, my father, or I ever left the house in the morning for work or school without a lunch put together by Mom. Those who knew her best will also verify this, that her all-time favorite thing to do in the world, and I mean all-time favorite thing to do in the world, was, wait for it, laundry. And yes, I mean just normal everyday laundry and ironing. She cherished a new iron like a guy might cherish a new socket set or power saw. She loved hanging her sheets out on her clothesline, and I didn't realize till I got older that practice had kind of gone out with Ike and Mamie Eisenhower. But she loved it, and that's an image I think Chris and I will always have. Summer day, a day like today, a light breeze, Mom's out in the backyard hanging sheets up on the line, and you hear Herb Carneal's voice, bellowing out the window, covering the Twins game. She loved the Twinkies, and yeah. Then there wasn't a single business trip that my dad went on, or vacation that the family took, without precisely packed suitcases filled with pressed clothes, totally organized, everything nice and neat. She loved cutting funny and odd headlines out of the newspaper. Most of them were bad puns, some of them were a few good ones, usually pertaining to sporting events. And speaking of sporting events, this was the one area of her life where she wasn't exactly ladylike. I would have friends over to watch a Vikings game, for instance, and I might forget to warn them. The very first lousy call that went against the Vikes, and any call that went against the Vikes was lousy, my friends would hear a flurry of vocabulary that they might have never heard before. I'd be just about willing to bet you the team of Navy SEALs that got Bin Laden, she could probably make a couple of them blush. My parents were at the 1975 NFC Divisional Playoff game. Yes, that game. If the irate fan who threw the bottle at referee Armin Terzian hadn't, Mother might have done the deed herself. And remember, she was a crack shot. Her all-time favorite sports hero was the great Vikings quarterback Joe Kapp. Many of you might know this, might not know this, but my father's from Sandusky, Ohio, and that means primarily two things. Saturdays, Buckeye football. Sundays, Cleveland Browns football. Dad was still an ardent Browns fan when they came to town for a playoff game in the late 60s, and the Browns were really giving it to our Purple People Eaters. Until midway through the third quarter when Joe Kapp began to lead the Vikes back. Kapp went back to pass, the pocket collapsed, and Joe began to run. I forget the linebacker's name who tried to tackle Joe, but after Kapp hit him, I don't think even he knew what his name was anymore. Joe Kapp, a quarterback, knocked out a linebacker cold, out like a light. Mother never let Father live that one down. I think even after they were separated, she still teased him about it. Needless to say, Dad quickly switched his Sunday allegiance to the purple. I want to make one quick mention about government, and it relates pretty closely to our family. And it's about big government and big government ideas. Christopher's and my grandparents came from 4 different states. Dad's parents were from Michigan and Ohio. Mom's were from Kansas and Minnesota. The New Deal brought all 4 of them together. Mom and Becky's dad went to work for the Civilian Conservation Corps and was stationed near Waterville, Minnesota, where he met the woman he would soon marry, and that would be Mom and Becky's mother. Less than 30 years later, the new frontier brought our mom and dad together. Mother was serving in the Peace Corps in Asmara, Ethiopia, also home to the then largest radio monitoring station in the world, the U.S. Army base at Cagnew Station. Years later, a friend of Mom's would tell her, "Well, Linda, at least you don't have to say you met your future husband in a bar." To which Mother replied, "Actually, we did meet in a bar. It was Takeski's in downtown Asmara." After nearly 2 years of marriage and with me in tow, they bought a home in Brooklyn Park. Mother was active, very active, with the Minneapolis Girls Club and the League of Women Voters, and worked part-time at Dayton's over at Brookdale. She would take $15.97 a month out of those paychecks from Dayton's to pay off a loan she had gotten from Encyclopedia Britannica to procure a copy of the collection known as the Great Books for Chris and me. Again, the reading, the literature. Father, in the meantime, went to work for Lagerquist Elevators and soon joined an organization that would alter both of their lives in many great ways, the JCs. Many of the people that Mom and Dad worked with in the JCs are here today. Those were indeed treasured times. But it was her Peace Corps experiences, however, that would change her life forever. As Deb mentioned, Mom and Becky were both raised cloth coat, respectable Republicans. The 2 primary dogs they had growing up were named Stassen and Ike. My grandfather, the one who was with the CCC, was fortunate enough to buy in and get a Shell oil gas station in the mid to late 40s. But the biggest piece of advice he gave to his daughters was to always be willing to work hard and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Advice that, when she got to Africa, just didn't seem very practical in a country where hardly any of the children even have shoes, let alone boots. Incidentally, the other major piece of advice her father gave her was, if they look like they're going to hit you, hit them first. Grandpa Jerry was like that, the whole spectrum. This advice proved a little more practical when she was just a little girl. A neighborhood kid came after Mother with an axe. I don't know if he intended to do her any real harm, but the act's enough was frightening enough to cause Mother to hightail it for home. Her mom was on the phone, and the screen door from the garage was locked. The kid came into the garage, axe raised over his head, when Mother cold-cocked him with a DDT spray can. Just like her hero, Joe Cap, would do some 20 years later. She knocked him cold. And speaking of advice, and this relates back to the quote from Gatsby, I could have said that quote from Gatsby a different way. Mom would have put it, I don't like guys who minimize and criticize the enterprise of other guys whose enterprise has made them rise above the guys who minimize and criticize. But there was some really great advice that she gave to Chris and me. Some of the best advice or words of encouragement. She would say, usually to me, because I needed it, Scott, sometimes I was the only person in marching band who was marching in step. Both Mom and I were drummers, and she cemented that notion in my head by giving me a plaque to hang on my wall with Thoreau's great quote about the different drummer on it. It takes courage to not just stand out, but to be vocal about it, to draw attention to yourself. Mom had courage to spare. Of course, it was tough to be politically or socially active in that day and age without coming to grips with the war in Vietnam. It was June of 1972, and our family was at Atlanta for the National JC Convention. We celebrated Mother's birthday on Friday the 16th. Saturday was, of course, the Watergate break-in. I can still see her, seriously, still see her sitting on that bed in that hotel room, reading the news out loud, the small stories that had appeared in Sunday's paper about the break-in. It was the first time I ever heard the 3 letters S-O-B. She was sure he was behind it from the get-go. Later that day, in a packed to capacity convention hall, the keynote speaker was none other than Vice President Spiro Agnew. While every single other person in that convention hall sat in their seats and listened to the Veep, Mother stood on her chair on the main floor, holding a sign that read merely, "End the war." Dad and the small group of their friends were trying to hide behind their napkins as the Secret Service edged closer to their table. She stood there for the entire speech. Humor. She loved humor. A gal from Carol Levin asked me, what was your mom's sense of humor like? And it was pretty dark and pure gallows. She loved The Onion. And in the spirit of the great newslet, The Onion, I would just like to say that our family will forever remember Mom's cowardly battle with cancer. You have to read The Onion to figure that one out, because everyone always says, okay, yeah, you'll figure it out. My favorite birthday card that I ever got from her, I was away at Culver Military Academy, and my birthday's in the fall, so we're back at school. And the card said, nothing on the front, but there was a cartoon of 2 kind of pimply-faced little pre-teenager kids with a very large, and I might add very militant-looking African-American man with his fist raised in the air. I opened the card, and it said, "Happy birthday from the Cleavers, Wally, the Beeve, and Eldridge." One more quick story about her courage. When Mom was in the Peace Corps, she traveled extensively in Africa, often alone, in countries where a squad of Marines probably wouldn't go. She was in Khartoum, Sudan, by herself, to go to a double feature movie. The Beatles' Hard Day's Night had just come out, and of course Elvis Presley's Blue Hawaii. She was not only the only Caucasian in the theater, but she was the only woman in the theater. And relayed that story like it was nothing. You know, you kidding me? It was Elvis. Her favorite film was The Blues Brothers. She loved Remo Williams. She loved ninja movies. She darn near worshipped the ground that Melina McCurry walked on, the star of Top Copy and others. The Manchurian Candidate, 3 Days of the Condor, and Fate is the Hunter were other favorites. She made it to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. She was born into a family that hunted, fished, loved the outdoors, especially every minute spent at our family's cabin in McGregor. An interesting story about her Peace Corps experience. 20 years later, she was back in Minnesota, involved in politics. I think it may have been in the early or mid-'80s. And she was at an event, and unbeknownst to her, a gentleman that was in one of her classes in Asmara was also at the event. And he had no idea she was there either. When suddenly he heard a voice that he recognized and remembered over 20 years ago in Africa. And he ran across the room, ran up to her, "Miss Linda, Miss Linda." And sure enough, it was Mom. There wasn't a committee or commission that she wouldn't serve on to better the communities of Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center. She was a big fan of Jeffrey Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone. And she took stands, sometimes against her party, to faithfully serve her constituency. And I've lost my last page. But it's the last page. Aha. As anyone in public service knows, one of the greatest sacrifices you make is time away from your home, away from your family. I won't tell you that Mother's time away from home was always easy. In the end, though, Chris and I came to realize that we were sharing Mom with the rest of the people of Minnesota. I look out at the crowd of people gathered here today, some of you close friends and family, some of you friends, colleagues over the last 35 years or just recently, some of you constituents, neighbors, some who were fortunate to have known her, some of you maybe never got the chance to meet her, but your life was touched by something that she did, whether it be a piece of legislation or a cause she undertook. The hundreds of people who reached out to our family over the last couple of months, the outpouring of warmth and love, it's been the finest compliment that I think Chris or I could ever receive on behalf of someone else. It has absolutely been our family's pride and joy, our honor, our privilege to have shared her with all of you and all of Minnesota. And so, in that great legislative tradition, I would like to say one last time to you, Mom, sine die. Sons of Linda Scheid always come prepared. And I was going to say, Governor, she wasn't so much a lightning rod for the liquor bills as a stir stick. She was no teetotaler, but yeah, again, common sense. So, in honor of our mother, Linda Scheid, we'd like to thank all of you for coming, and Godspeed to all of you. And Mom, we miss you and we love you. And now I have likened this part of the afternoon, evening to be something of a wedding reception. I want everybody to mill around, to congregate. My good friend Craig Stellmacher there, halfway back with the video camera. Craig, we're still in this room here behind us. Craig will be in the room behind us, just through this door where it says lounge. And he's going to be filming whoever wants to come in and say a couple words or speak for a couple minutes about Mom. And we'll put it all together and make it available online at a later date. Decided not to, as I said, Mom wanted a couple songs played at her funeral. And I know we're right about at that hour marker, and so I'm decided to shorten. I'm going to play one, and it was her all-time favorite song. And she learned it, her mother taught it to her as a little girl, to sing whenever there was a monster under the bed or a violent thunderstorm outside. And her favorite version was from 1950 by Bing Crosby. So if you will oblige me exactly 2 minutes and 41 seconds, I will play her favorite song. Hold on.
I love those dear hearts and gentle people who live in my hometown, because those dear hearts and gentle people will never ever let you down.